Hello and welcome again. So, kind of like Billy the Kid was inspired by the whole John Wilkes Booth thing. This story, after I had done the Billy the Kid story, my husband sent me this and I was like, okay, I have to do this after I do Billy the Kid because wow, Old West history is like super exciting and fascinating to me. I like it. Anyway, so this is a war that cost the territory of Arizona many lives and over a decade of becoming a state. The Pleasant Valley War, also called the Tonto Basin Feud, the Tonto Basin War, and the Tewksbury-Graham Feud. But what really happened, and why are some things still so shrouded in secrecy? So, the Pleasant Valley War was fought in Pleasant Valley, Arizona between the years 1882 and 1892. 10 years. The most deadly years were 1886 to 1887, with the last known killing taking place in 1892. The estimated death toll was between 35 and 50, but no one is really absolutely clear. The war involved two families. No, not the Hatfield and McCoys. It was the Grahams and the Tewksburys. I said that in the intro. Both families were cattle ranchers, but the Tewksburys would branch out into sheep eventually, which only made the simmering war much worse. Apparently, there were numerous other settlers upset at the sight of sheep on the open range, originally utilized only for cattle. Even those who did not side with either family once the warring started would unite themselves to defend their range from the sheep, and eventually every man would be drawn into this long war. So, let's start at the beginning, because hi. Edwin Tewksbury was born in 1858 in San Francisco, California, the second son of James Tewksbury and his Native American wife. In total, the children were John, Jim, Edwin, Frank, and one daughter. They would eventually end up in Arizona to start out their ranching business, mostly horses and cattle. The Graham family immigrated from Ireland in 1851 and originally settled in Ohio. In total, the family was Samuel Graham, his wife Jane, and 5 children: Alan, Margaret, Mary, John, and Thomas. When Jane passed away in 1861, Samuel would marry Mary Getzman, and they would have an additional 7 children. That's a lot of mouths to feed. The family would stake claims in Arizona in 1881 after being invited by Edwin Tewksbury. Initially, Thomas Graham and John Tewksbury would start out as friends, but that would change when cattleman James Stinson arrived in Pleasant Valley, which is present-day Young, Arizona, in 1881. Stinson would bring about 600 head of cattle and branded them with a T, which turns out it was a brand that was, easy to alter, and there would soon be about a dozen or more brands stamped on cows. There were different variations of the T. So you see, Stinson sold his ranch on Silver Creek to Mormons who planned to establish Snowflake, Arizona. The payment for the ranch? Allegedly, it was cows, which Stinson then took with him to Pleasant Valley. With his arrival, he would attempt to buy out other ranchers to establish his own cattle empire, but that bid was unsuccessful. It didn't help that he preferred to reside in Salt River Valley and would hire a 24-year-old named John Gilliand to run his empire. That never really became an empire. So the trouble started in 1833 after Stinson learned that both the Grahams and the Tewksburys were among some of the people who were making off with his cattle. Not wanting to start a shooting war, he decided to go with the divide and conquer. So, knowing the Tewksbury side wouldn't take part in any kind of a double cross, he approached John Graham on November 14th, 1883, and made an oral agreement, the Treaty of War, that would provide information to charge anyone with stealing Stinson's cattle with a payoff to the Graham family being in cows. Specifically, 25 cows and 25 calves for each conviction. Cattle was the currency of the day. The agreement would be filed in Prescott, Arizona on March 28, 1884, which is where 3 days earlier, John Graham registered the TE Connected brand for a partnership between Tom Graham and Edwin Tewksbury in Tom Graham's name, the Double Cross. This would lead John Graham filing a felony complaint on March 29, 1884 against 3 Tewksbury brothers, George Blaine, Bill Richards, and Herb Bishop, with the charge that they stole 62 of Stinson's cows. This did not go well for the Graham brothers, as during the trial in Prescott that June, the agreement between John Graham and Stinson would become known. This resulted in the jury seeing the Grahams as trumping up charges for financial gain. The case would be dismissed, and perjury charges would be leveled against the Grahams, where Judge Summer Howard would have them arrested. The Tewksburys thought that people didn't like them due to the fact that they had Native American blood, but there was the cattle rustling, horse stealing, and brand altering, so, there's that. For the Tewksburys' troubles on their way home from Prescott, Frank would contract pneumonia and die shortly thereafter. This would lead the family to blame Frank's death on Stinson and his crooked double-crossing ways. That makes sense. Having had enough trouble in Pleasant Valley, which he caused, Stinson would sell his ranch, his horses, and his cows on May 1st, 1884. The new owners would then move Stinson's cattle to the Salt River Valley in August of 1884. Stinson may have been gone, but the one thing that he managed to do was to turn 2 families, once friends, against one another. Troublemakers gonna make trouble. Apparently, though, Stinson still had a ranch house, and on July 23rd, 1884, John Tewksbury, William Richards, George Blaine, and Ed Rose would visit the ranch house, supposedly to plan an upcoming rodeo. The group would be met by Marion McCann, the ranch foreman, and 5 other cowhands, where McCann would ask the Tewksbury group to leave, all except for Ed Rose, as he hadn't taken a side in the conflict. He was Switzerland. Insults were hurled back and forth after the Tewksburys tried to reason with McCann, and then things got heated when George Blaine called McCann out to face him right before he fired a shot at him. Because that's how you get someone to come out and talk to you. You shoot at them. Even though Blaine's shot went high, McCann would retaliate by shooting Blaine in the throat. And this would lead John Tewksbury to also fire at McCann before he was shot and wounded. The group would ride off. Blaine would survive his wound, and the groups would settle the rest of their fighting in court. After Stinson left Arizona, the Grahams would actually find themselves in dire straits. By 1885, they lost a large number of their herd, and they were caught driving cattle that didn't belong to them. Thievery! It was also in 1885 when the Tewksburys would start bringing in herds of sheep. This would make the feud worse. Apparently, the Tewksbury brothers were leasing some sheep from the Daggs brothers in northern Arizona. It is believed that people with cattle had issues with the Tewksbury sheep due to the destructive eating habits of sheep on the open range that the Grahams said left nothing for their cattle. So, property lines along the water and grazing rights were now adding fuel to an already embered fire. It's like, don't let your sheep eat here. So the eruption would absolutely turn deadly when a Navajo employed by the Tewksbury's was herding sheep in the Mogollon Rim area in February of 1887. Apparently, this was the accepted line across which the sheep were not permitted to graze. Tom Graham would shoot the employee and either drive out or destroy the sheep. William Graham would be shot on August 17, 1887 in an ambush as he rode a trail between Payson and Pleasant Valley, but survived long enough to say that it was Ed Tewksbury who was the shooter. Apache County Deputy Sheriff James D. Hawk would announce that he was responsible for killing William Graham, which led some people to believe that this was an act to take pressure off of Ed Tewksbury. But in the end, a jury would find Tewksbury guilty in absentia, and Sheriff Mulvernon went to arrest him only to learn that he had fled to the hills. In September of 1887, a faction of the Grahams would surround a Tewksbury cabin and shoot John Tewksbury and William Jacobs as they fled, killing them both. The faction did not stop firing on the cabin until Mrs. Tewksbury came out with a shovel to bury the two dead men. Andy Blevins would be overheard bragging that it was him who killed both men a few days later, and this would lead Holbrook Sheriff Commodore Perry Owens to opt to arrest him, as he already had a warrant for Blevins' arrest for rustling cattle. Of course. On September 4th, 1887, Owens would arrive at the Blevins' home while they were in the midst of Sunday dinner. Blevins refused to come out, and his half-brother John would open the door and shoot at the sheriff, who in turn drew his gun, shooting both John and Andy. This resulted in a gunfight. I know, shocking. A gunfight in the Old West. Sam Blevins, 15 years old, would run out the door, shooting at Owens, who returned fire. The Blevin family friend Mose Roberts would also shoot at Owens. The shootout lasted less than a minute and left Andy and Sam Blevin and Mose Roberts dead and John Blevins wounded. Apparently, even though Owens was a lone gunman against several people shooting at him, he was not injured. It made him a legend. And maybe they were stormtroopers. Owens would be fired by Holbrook, even though the shooting was ruled self-defense. Dude takes fire, defends himself, survives unscathed, and his thanks is, "You're fired." September 22nd, 1887, Tewksbury sympathizers, led by Prescott Sheriff Mulvern, would pursue John and Tom Graham and Charles Blevins to Young, Arizona, on instructions from Governor Conrad Zulick. The three men were approaching the Perkins store, which is today the Pleasant Valley Museum, in town when Mulvernon demanded their surrender, which led to a shootout. Why would it not? When the smoke had cleared and the shooting was over, John Graham and Charles Blevins were dead, but Tom Graham was able to escape. Side note, there are sources that claim that it was just John Graham and Charles Blevins who were going to the store and Tom Graham wasn't there at all. So, I don't know. Depends on which account I guess you're reading. It was either the three of them or just the two of them. But, Tom Graham, not injured. Moving on. There would be a grand jury hearing about the events of the shootout at the Perkins store, with Mulvernon stating that John Graham and Charles Blevins both reached for their guns, thus forcing him and his posse to open fire. However, during testimony, it was stated that Blevins died quickly, and a member of the posse ran up to the mortally wounded Graham and shot him again. There were other members of the posse that would testify that Mulvernon opened fire before demanding the men surrender, further stating that at least some members of the posse had an understanding with Mulvernon that no members of the Grahams were to be taken alive. Yet other members stated that they had no idea of this understanding and didn't draw their weapons. One member stated he tried to stop the shooting of the dying Graham. Despite all of the testimony from the posse, Mulvernon was found not guilty, stoking that raging fire even more. It would be 6 weeks later when a member of the Graham faction, Al Rose, was killed by 8 men wearing long coats and masks near a ranch belonging to the Grahams. The next few years after the events of 1887, there will be several lynchings and unsolved murders, claims of disemboweled corpses left for wild pigs from both sides of the war, frequently by masked men. John Tewksbury would die of natural causes, and one of the allies of the Tewksburys, George Newton, drowned in the Salt River. It's unknown whether he was going to or coming from a meeting with Ed Tewksbury, and it was rumored that the Grahams were responsible for his death. Eventually, there were only 2 people left. One was Tom Graham. Tom would give up his place in Prescott and go to the Salt River Valley, eventually settling, let me say that twice, in Tempe. He would marry a woman named Annie Milton and make plans to sell his stock up north and restart his business in Tempe. However, on August 2nd, 1892, Tom was shot in the back by 2 assassins after they called out to him, and when he looked over his shoulder, he was shot. Tom would say that it was Ed Tewksbury and John Rhodes who shot him. Ed would be accused of the murder, with the first trial ending in a mistrial due to a legal technicality. It would be during the second trial when Tom's widow attempted to assassinate Ed, but her pistol got caught in her dress and she was removed from the courtroom. The second trial was deadlocked 7-5 for acquittal, despite witnesses confirming that Ed was one of the murderers. The jury would deem that Ed was not present at the murder of Tom. Ed would die in Globe in 1904, and prior to his death, he would confess to his stepmother that he was the one who did, in fact, murder Tom Graham. So, I bet you're probably wondering, like, how on earth did this affect Arizona being admitted into the Union? Well, there was quite a bit going on in Arizona at the time, and for that reason, their first attempt for statehood was vetoed by President William Howard Taft. According to historian Marshall Trimble, with the Apache Wars, the shootout at the OK Corral, the Outlaws, the Pleasant Valley War, all gave Arizona the reputation as a wild place not ready for statehood, and the eastern states didn't like the idea of having 2 new senators from a place still unsettled. They figured they'd probably send a couple of gun-toting cowboys. Maybe they would have. But it's not likely. Things had changed quite a bit by the early 1900s. At the time, Prescott was the biggest city and the territorial capital, with Phoenix being maybe the 3rd or 4th largest city in the territory, which is kind of wild to think about if you look at Phoenix today. And it's also the capital. It was initially proposed that Arizona and New Mexico combine and become one state, with Santa Fe being the capital. But Arizonans overwhelmingly voted against it. They were like, oh. There would be delegations and debates for some time. Arizona wanted to give women the right to vote at that time, and they wanted the right to recall judges, which was opposed by President Taft. Arizona would take out the problematic issues and then wait for statehood, and then they'd add them back in. On February 14th, 1912, Arizona would become State 48, and later that year, women would be granted the right to vote in the state of Arizona. So not just the Pleasant Valley War that, cost Arizona statehood for like a decade because, people can't get along. But, all the outlaws, the OK Corral, down in Tombstone, cool place to go if you've never been. Anyway, Range Wars, Apache Wars, Pleasant Valley War. Oh my gosh, everything, all the stuff that's going on. What a time to be alive. Or, killed, depending on how good of a shot you were. Did you know about this war? Did you know about it costing Arizona statehood for so long? Were one of the reasons that Arizona was cost statehood for so long? Let me know down in the comments. And while you're down there, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the video, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.